So what did we talk about last week? Does anybody remember? We talked about peace. Thank you, Tom. So one of the things we talked about, we went to Hebrews chapter 12, and we talked about how we should sow gentleness, and we should try to live at peace with one another through justice and through the fruit of the Spirit, which bears righteousness. And one thing I said kind of at the end of class that was really important was that we as Christians should think about this kind of urgently. The Hebrews passage, I'm pulling it up on my phone, which is the reason I have started emailing slides is because they're always available on my phone. Seems like a waste of paper to print them out and not look at it, but at least I know I've always got a copy. So we talked about Hebrews 12, and it says, "See that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root or bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and may become defiled by it." And so one of the things we said was that this was something kind of urgent, and we needed to deal with it in an urgent way. And so I want to ask you the question is, how important is one sheep? If you were looking at the PowerPoint, that's what you'd see. Does anybody know about how much, Ray, a sheep is worth? Does anybody know?
On the current market, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $300.
Okay, so in the current market, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $300.
Well, that's not breed specific.
That's just kind of overall. I just need overall, because I don't think Jesus was breed specific. But how important is a sheep? What would your answer be to that? Ray says $300 to $400. Absolutely. And the Think Soul slide, Matthew 18, says that one sheep is pretty important. If you want, I'm not pressuring you, but if you want to give me $300 to $400, that'd make my day. Yeah, that'd make my day. Low standards.
At the time, sheep were probably priceless.
That's true.
Because you couldn't just run down to the stockyards and pick up a half.
There were a lot more scarcity of resources.
Right.
So you think a sheep being even worth more than $300 or $400? But the Think Soul slide says Matthew 18 verses 12 through 14. This is what that slide says, or the scripture. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly, I say to you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray. So is it not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should not perish? So we go back to the question, how important is a sheep? Well, pretty important. Valuable in that time. But when we start thinking about sheep as people or souls, it gets really important. Important enough to leave the 99 in a relatively safe area, as safe as that area can be for sheep, and to go and search for the one sheep. So what's this parable talking about? What do you think it's talking about? What's Jesus saying? What's the point of the parable? Souls, think souls? We got a bad news here. Okay, seeking and saving the lost.
Yes, I think it's possible that the shepherd was alone with the flock.
Okay.
But I also think it's just as possible that he was not leaving the rest of the flock uncovered.
It's probable.
So if I'm working from the assumption that he's left one with them to stay for oversight, and he's gone off on his own, it's probably the more mature of the shepherds that's doing the search, while a younger, maybe less mature, is just tending the flock in this one area. Don't let them go too far. Stay right there. I'll be back.
Yeah, you leave the sheep in a relatively safe place with the green horns, and then you go into the mountains. And that's literally what the text says, going to the mountains.
And so then the thought to me is that some of this is going to be easier, and some of it's going to be more challenging, and we need to see and understand what our role is,
Uh-huh.
and then work through it.
I would agree with that. We need to see and understand our role, and we need to work in it. And I agree with that. Jesus is really kind of talking about himself here. And, of course, that's the example we're supposed to emulate. That's a good lesson to draw from it. Anybody else want to add? If you're in a group, oh yeah, groups are safe. Peter talked about that. He said Satan, was it Peter or James? Peter says that Satan's like a lion. But James talks about temptation luring us away from the group when we're being led astray on our own. And so that's good. That's a good point. So we kind of think, and I'm not picking on the designer of the Think Soul slides, but we kind of think that this is about evangelism, and that's like a lesson to draw from this. That's a good lesson to draw from this. But if you look at this in the chapter, I'm not sure that that's Jesus' main point, because he's talking about sheep that belong to the flock. And so this 2 verses is separated in the middle of 2 important conversations. The first is about children. So you see that in verse 14, right? So that the will of my Father is in heaven is that one of these little ones should not perish. I don't know, whatever. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven so that one of these little ones should perish. So it's not God's will. Jesus is talking about the children because the children have come to Jesus, and the disciples tried to shoo them away and say these children don't matter. They're just children in that society. You didn't get too attached to children because half of them wouldn't live to adulthood. And so they shoo the children away. And Jesus says, wait. I love kids. Bring these children to me. Like, I'm going to bless them. I'm going to put my hands on them. And he talks about how important children are in the kingdom of God. And so this sheep parable is a little bit about the children. But why we're talking about this in peace class is because it's really kind of Jesus' transition statement to talk about what you do when someone sins. And specifically what you do when someone sins in the church. So, you know, if we're supposed to have 100 sheep and we lose one, we go out and we get that sheep. And so it's good to think about the sheep who are wild and don't belong to the flock and maybe need to be domesticated. That's a lesson to draw from this. But Jesus' point is that when a sheep is missing, you bring that sheep back. And if we're going to define peace as being whole and complete, and we're going to say that peace has not 2 parts, because that's not great language, but we're going to say that peace has an internal and an external component. When we think about peace, as we said last week, about being harmony and living together, this passage becomes really relevant because the lost sheep, I wouldn't think of that as the person that's not been saved. I would think of that as the person from our midst who's gone away. Does that make sense? Good to make an evangelism application. But the intent of Jesus' passage is say, when you lose a brother, go get the brother.
And when I said souls, I meant souls.
Yeah.
Not just going out to evangelize, but the ones that we lose ourselves, because at some point in time, all of us are tempted and may fall away.
That's right. And so when we say think souls, we're talking about all of the souls, not just the lost ones. And Ray pointed that out, and that's true. It falls in the category.
Something I keep thinking about is, I know $300, I'd be sad if I lost $300. But when I think about having 100 sheep, and there's, things that can happen, diseases and other animals that can get them, and they get lost, it's like, with 100 sheep, chances are you're going to lose one. Like, it's easy for me to fall into that mindset. It's hard to keep 100 sheep. But it was still so important that they did everything they could to keep those 100 sheep. So I think we need to remember that sometimes I don't ever want us to fall into the trap of, we tried, it was a shame that person left. Like, no, we need to do everything.
Can't keep them all. You win some, you lose some.
So, I think we really need to work very hard to keep that group. But it is very easy
Absolutely. A lot of times we lose a sheep and we say, oh, well, you're never going to keep 100 sheep, right? You're going to lose one eventually. So something probably got it. It maybe fell in the crevasse.
Cultural significance that is awfully easy to miss here too. We can't really understand what it meant to a shepherd of that time to lose a sheep.
That's true.
For one thing, he might not own the sheep, and it might be his job, his livelihood, that he'd lose if he lost, if he couldn't. But apart from that, it's a cultural situation that we can't just simply say it's a $300, $400, $500 sheep.
Yeah, that's true. Because the price of a sheep's changed over time. But yeah, it is cultural. Go ahead, Elijah.
I was going to agree with what Emily just said, because I have heard this said many times, where people have, in a dying church or a shrinking church, where members are leaving because of one reason or another, but they're not, they're falling away essentially. And then people say, well, look at Jesus. He started with thousands and he ended up with 120. Therefore, we should expect that same trend in our churches. We should expect people to leave and we should be okay with that. And that seems to be a trend in a lot of congregations for them to justify and feel okay with letting people slip away. But that is in total contrast to what this parable is all about, is how important it is that one sheep is that went away.
Yeah.
So, I've just heard that talk, and it seems like we're trying to put ourselves in a comfort zone where we feel okay about that.
Well, we're trying to talk ourselves out of feeling guilty and ashamed. There's some truth to the fact that, not everybody's going to stay faithful. People are going to fall away. The question is what effort do we put into getting them back? And having peace, and this feels a little bit more off topic than I thought it would, but having peace in a congregation means doing the uncomfortable things that this passage talks about. And so a lot of times I think we do, like you were saying, Elijah, placate ourselves and say, well, we don't have to. Well, we're just going to lose folks. And those are people who are falling away. Go ahead.
Even when you're looking at TV today,
Uh-huh.
people don't talk about church, but they're advocating for all of the poor animals that are abused or left behind or something, and they're not even talking about being a Christian or living what I consider a normal life the best way to live life. So you just have to really turn the TV off anymore.
Yeah.
Because it's so disturbing.
Yeah. There's not a lot out there in pop culture that even closely mimics our values. It's a different world now. And you're right, it's sometimes worth turning off. And so we're not getting good messages from anybody. Chuck?
Even if we can't keep, stray away, you also need to get new flock.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's important to keep what you got and get more. And that's how the herd grows. I see what you're saying. That's very good. That's very true as well. So let's dig into this passage with the sheep that we have tonight. That's a little smaller than I thought it would be. Elijah, you ought to take these slides and take out the tree so that I have more room on the slide. And you have those fancy Photoshop skills that I don't have. So it says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. And if he listens to you, you've gained your brother. So this is immediately, Jesus says that sheep thing, and then he says this. He says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. And if he listens to you, you have gained your brother. Verse 18, if he does not listen, take one or two along with you, so that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And again I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among them. That's another one that's often misunderstood. So we kind of got a 3-step plan for peace. Peace is not mentioned in the passage, but if we're talking about relational peace, we got a 3-step plan. That is followed up by verse 21 and 22, which is Peter's dumb question. You know, Peter's always saying dumb things like the roof shouldn't be green when the roof is green and the walls are green and the carpet's green and everybody's wearing a green shirt. Peter says dumb things like that. And he says, well, God, how many? Well, he's really saying, oh, yeah, he's saying God. He's saying, oh, Jesus, when do I have to forget? Like, how often do I have to do this forgiveness thing that you're talking about? And is 7 times enough? Like, if Peter probably thinks he's being really generous, right? I mean, I got to forgive somebody 8 times? And Jesus says not 7 times, but 77 times, which is kind of symbolic. I think a different gospel says 70 times 7. That's a symbolic number. Yeah. Correct. Ray said perfect numbers, which is as the Jews recognized. And so this is important because peace, harmony, reconciliation are at the core of the gospel. The Apostle Paul says in one of his letters, I forget which one, he said that God has given him a ministry of reconciliation. And it may be Galatians because he's talking about the Jews and the Gentiles. But this idea of peace, harmony, forgiveness, it's at the core of the gospel. And that's why Jesus in Matthew 18 answers Peter's question with the parable of the unforgiving servant. He says, you know, God forgives a servant and that servant doesn't forgive. He says a master forgives a servant and that servant doesn't forgive. And so the master undoes the original forgiveness. Read that parable sometime. I did a poor job explaining it. But you get the point. So let's go back to this passage and let's talk about our 3 steps for peace. Number 1 is we go to the person. It's fairly straightforward. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. And if he listens to you, you've gained a brother. So we talked about this idea of going in the mountains and finding the lost sheep and bringing that lost sheep back to the 99. Jesus tells us that finding the lost sheep means going to someone when they sin against you. And so we like to talk about evangelism programs, and we like to talk about, handing out pamphlets, and we talk about inviting people to church. But according to this passage, Jesus says you find a lost sheep by talking to them when they sin against you. If your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault. So that's a command. It's not really a suggestion. And so this is what a lost sheep looks like. So why do you guys think this is so difficult? Okay. Most people do what they can to avoid confrontations. We do not like to be uncomfortable.
We also don't like to be told the wrong, so people tend to get defensive as a first reaction. And that's what drives away.
We don't like to be told we're wrong. And so we often get defensive. Elijah?
Another thing is that we like to think that we're a forgiving person. So I'm just going to forgive them and not go tell them what they did wrong. I'm just not going to hold it against them.
That's a lie we tell us to placate ourselves. That's something we say to feel better, to rob us of that uncomfortable duty. We could break that down and we could peel back the layers of the onion. That's kind of a really selfish thing to think. Like, I'm going to avoid the conflict and I'm just going to swallow this burden. And we play it up like it's really nice in our heads. But if we're talking about sin, and we are talking about sin, If someone has sinned against you, like you're just hurting them. You're not doing them a favor by forgiving them. And I preached on how that's not really forgiveness. I'll preach on it again in a few years. You guys will forget I did it, and I'll pull out those notes.
Does that mean that we're depriving them of the opportunity to seek repentance?
We are depriving them of the opportunity to seek repentance. And if you believe what I believe, that's leaving them up in the mountains lost. I mean, that's the sheep that is wandering around missing. It's that brother that sins.
It's highly possible that they didn't know they did anything to upset you, and so they did it again because they didn't know.
Yeah. And hopefully,
It continues to cause problems and continues to drive away.
yeah. And I mean, you guys I've already read how this ends, right? Either it's a person who doesn't know any better and repents, or it's a person who's a troublemaker and they're gone. And so at least they quit making trouble. I mean, if they're already lost, if they're the missing sheep, at least they're not in the sheep pen breaking down the fence, leading other sheep on a grand escape. Tom?
Always a possibility that it's a big misunderstanding.
It's usually, I wouldn't even say it's a possibility. It's usually a big misunderstanding or something that can be resolved quickly. I mean, 80% of the time, I would guess 80, this ends with hugs and apologies fairly quickly, fairly easily. The problem is that we don't do this when we should do this, and then wounds fester and bitterness builds up. I'm sure that wouldn't happen here, though. But, you got a lot of churches where you got old wounds that are 10, 15 years old, and it's not that simple anymore. But it would have been that simple 10 years ago. So that's why it's urgent. You don't wait on things like this. So we avoid confrontation. We often get defensive. I think we're afraid in the defensiveness in others.
Well, and I think it takes a certain amount of skill
It does.
to, first off, if you're the mad person and that other person doesn't know, and you don't go with the right attitude and not like you're mad and just happening, and everything it says, you have to do it with love.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people are just so, like you said, nervous about doing something like that. So it's all in how you do it, the attitude you do it with, as to how that person will perceive it. So you kind of have to have a certain sense of peace with yourself
You do have to have peace with yourself. You have to have personal skills.
before you can go and do something and it be effective.
And you have to have, Tom's going to say something really good, but you also have to have a measure of emotional intelligence.
So, to put a couple things together here is, Emily made the point that people will get defensive. And Tammy's exactly right, in that if we go and you did this to me, of course somebody's going to get defensive. Whereas if we phrase it differently, if we own it and say, look, when you did this, this is how it made me feel. That comes across much.
That's a good way to do it. That's a fine, refined skill way.
Yeah, that's a much different presentation of the same basic facts.
Yeah. I say a lot in couples counseling. Okay, what I really need you to do right now is talk about yourself, and use those I statements that you're talking about.
So, this is what I, often tell myself. God wants us to serve Him. So if we're trying to do something His way, I have full faith He's going to help us. So if our goal is reconciliation, and I think that's the key. The goal is not to point out what they did wrong. The goal is reconciliation. And so that keeps us with a more humble heart, and that keeps us from being just being calmer. But I think if we're worried about our own emotions and our own approach, pray about it a lot. And I firmly believe that even if we don't do it perfectly, God will be there to help and help the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pray and just be merciful and graceful and have that character of God, and He'll help us when we obey Him. It's all about starting to sound like my mother. Hey, Mom, I know she's watching. But it's all about the tone. And sometimes you just got to make sure you have the right tone. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And we'll get there. We'll get there. But it's not about gossip, because the first thing you got to do is go to them. The second thing you got to do is gather some witnesses or some people who can talk some sense into them. And that's dangerous territory if you don't do that right. Go ahead, Sarah.
I think also too, we have to think of if somebody is coming to us about something, so we have to have the right attitude. You know, if Sonia was to come to me, I need to have, whether I've done something to her, I need to have a good attitude when she brings that to me. I think that's great too.
Yeah, that's a great plan. A great comment. We have to prepare. Like my wish, if I got a wish tonight, it would be that we all started practicing this perfectly. And by we all, I mean not just people here. I'm not going to waste my wish on that. If everybody in the church, yeah, thank you. If I could change one thing really quickly in all churches, it would be we all start taking this really seriously and practicing it. And if I did that, if I got my wish this week, what I mean by that is not just the teens here, but everybody at home and everybody who's somewhere else. You would probably go to somebody this week, and somebody would probably come to you this week. Does that make sense? Like if I could snap my fingers and make everybody in the church do this personally, you're probably talking to somebody, and somebody's probably talking to you this week, at minimum. So keep that in mind. Sarah's got a good comment that we got to be ready to receive.
And that helps us in our approach to other people. If we think about how we would respond if somebody came to us, I think that helps us take a more gentle approach when we go to somebody.
That's right. If we think about how we would respond, that kind of puts us in the shoes of the other person. We experience both sides of the table.
And you know, we talk about the golden rule,
Yeah.
and really that ties into it. And that's one of the things that my grandfather taught me was, you know, and this was before I was becoming a state trooper, is that you're going to be in a situation where it's not always going to be pleasant. He said, but if you can treat people like you would want to be treated in the same type of situation, it's probably going to go a lot better.
That's right. Yeah. It's the golden rule. It's treat people the way you want to be treated. It works in relationships. I mean, it also works in business. You just help people and business works out. I don't take a lot of new clients. I'm really focusing in on couples. I don't keep a waiting list. A lot of professionals keep a waiting list. I don't do that. I send you to somebody else. But everybody who calls me, I work hard to make sure that they get with the right person that can take care of them. I just don't say, so sorry, I don't have any availability. You just take care of people. And that kind of thing comes around. Because when you take care of people, people take care of you. And when you treat people the way you'd want to be treated, it works out the way it should. That's God's plan. And so that's class. So we got through step 1. We'll talk about steps 2 and 3 next week.